So we talked about the importance of personal selling and a little bit about what it is. Now let's go down a level and talk about the different types of personal selling. There are many ways to cut this up, and really 3 is probably the minimum number of segments that you think about in terms of different types of sellers. And as you've read in the book, you have the 3 types. You have the order getters, you have the order takers, and then you have what's known as supporting salespeople. And these could be very different personality types. You'll see in a moment how maybe one type of personality is better suited to a type of personal selling than another. So it's not true that selling is selling is selling is selling. That is not the case. There are so many different versions of this thing called selling. So let's look at the big bucket areas of selling. The first type of selling that we can consider is somebody who's called an order getter, or the term that we very often use in the industry is a hunter. And I think hunter describes it very well. This type of selling are people who go out and typically find new opportunities. We very often refer to it as new business. And hunting, I think, describes what the job is. This is about spotting a target, or if you think of a hunter, the prey, although in sales I think prey is maybe a little bit of a destructive word to use. But you think of a hunter spots the target, and then over a period of time will understand more about it, understand about its needs, and then in the case of sales, you'll then close the order. And so hunters are really people who are very motivated by new and are interested in the chase and are interested in the win. And to a company, hunting is a very, very important part of the business. You typically can't survive very easily if all you do is sustain and maintain your existing business. There is a need to create new business. And really that is the job of the hunter. So hunters are about new opportunities. And hunting applies in all of the different channels that you've been talking about. If you think about brand owners, I think you call them producers, then hunting is very clear. It's about finding brand new customers. Wholesalers also have to find new channels to market. They have to find new ways of taking their offering and their product to market. And then even in retail, if you walk into a store, then there are these people that whose job it is, although I think it's increasingly difficult to find people who can add value in this process, but there are people still in retail whose job it is to help create a comfortable level of relationship with you, to understand your needs and to form a new customer relationship with you. So that's the hunter. Now, something that's very different is the type of selling that we call the order taker, or again in the industry you typically refer to these as farmers. And if you know what farming is about, it's very different to hunting. I mean, first of all, farming tends to be very static. Hunting tends to be very mobile. Farming tends to take a lot of time. It's about repeat processes every year. You have to do the same thing. You have to clear the ground, or you have to put down weed killer, or whatever is the approach. So it's a very long investment in a static piece of ground. That's the concept of farming. Well, farming in the world of selling is exactly the same. These are salespeople who will have a relationship for a long time, multiple years, 5, 10, 15, 25 years in some cases. So you can imagine how the personality might be very different. Farmer type salespeople tend to value the status quo. They maybe don't like a lot of change. They don't get excitement from the new. Hunter type salespeople obviously would be bored very often with this notion of farming, with dealing with the same customer over multiple seasons, over multiple periods. So farmers call for a different type of seller. But farming is really important to a selling organization because it costs 10, 15, 20 times as much to find a new business as it is to maintain an existing business. So maintaining relationships with existing customers is a very, very important aspect of running a business. Again, same thing, farmers apply across all the different channels. So from a producer's perspective, think of what I used to do at Hewlett-Packard. My team used to focus on British Telecom. We only had one account. We had to farm them. We had to make sure they were happy. We had to make sure that everything they bought from us worked really well because we wanted them to buy more next year and more next year and more next year. And I had people in my team who had multiple years of relationship with the key buyers inside the client's organization. So brand owners need farmer-type salespeople. Wholesalers need farmer-type salespeople. These are people that maintain a really good relationship with the channel, make sure the channel's happy, make sure that they get what they need on time at the price that they want. And even in retail, there are some people who act as farmers. They're the people that have the relationships with the buyer. But again, retail is suffering, as you know, because of the competitive effects of technology. And increasingly, unfortunately, we're seeing that retail order takers or farmers are nothing more than sales clerks inside the retail organization. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out over the next few years. But there's been such a shake-up, and it continues in the world of retail. It'll be really interesting to see how long we need order takers per se as salespeople in that world. So farming, very important part to a business. And then there's the third type of salesperson. We call these supporting salespeople because on the surface they don't look like salespeople. In fact, they're probably not called salespeople. They might be called a technical specialist. They might be called a customer service rep. And then I think there's this other interesting category that you've read about in the book, which are missionary salespeople. And you can think of these as advocacy sellers. These aren't people that come across as very salesy, but what they can very often tend to be is very knowledgeable and very passionate and evangelical about their product, and so then get the buyer to want to buy the product, but they really have not been sold to per se. An example would be in the world of pharmaceutical selling. Pharmaceutical selling, is really an example of a missionary salesperson. I mean, I guess you know that pharma sales reps don't go into the office and basically open their jacket and say, do you want to buy some drugs? It doesn't actually work like that. It's not what we call a direct sell. The job of a pharmaceutical salesperson is to represent the capability of the offering to their buyer, which is typically a doctor, typically a physician, so that at some point in the future, the doctor remembers that conversation and feels the advocacy and feels the zeal almost that was represented by the salesperson, and also are knowledgeable enough to prescribe that drug for their patient. So, and that's the notion of missionary salespeople. On the surface, do not look like salespeople at all. They're very, very consultative, at least they should be, and really are there as information providers to the buyer. So the supporting sales role is very important to an organization. In fact, the more complicated your product is, the more complicated the offering is, the more you're likely to need some of these supporting roles, whether it is a technical specialist, or a customer service rep. And so these really are supporting, could be the hunters, could be the farmers, could be the more direct salespeople inside the organization. And when we talk about supporting, really what we're talking about is promoting the next purchase. Some research was done relatively recently about why people buy from a certain company. And what we discovered was the reason very often they buy from a certain organization is a lot to do with the salesperson and to do with the relationship that they have with that person. The flip side, we also investigated, why do companies stop buying from companies? Maybe companies that they've spent a lot of time, a number of years working with. And the primary reason that companies move away from an existing relationship from a buyer's perspective is if they feel that they're getting poor customer service. And so you could argue that customer service in and of itself is a part of the selling process. And that it really is something that if you provide really good customer service, you can offer as part of your promotion. It's something that you can say, this is why you should consider us. So customer service, even though in many places it might not even report into the sales function, is a key part of the selling process. And of course there what you find is that in customer service, the customer service reps very often are customer advocates. Now you have to be careful here. It is possible to overstep the line, to almost forget who it is that's writing your paycheck and to over-represent the customer. Finding this balance between representing the customer and understanding who you work for from the selling perspective is very, very important. But customer service, even though it's not the product, it's really a part of the total offering that goes to the customer. Here's something else that we're discovering in terms of the different types of salespeople, is that for different markets, you actually need different salespeople. And so increasingly, companies are taking a segmentation approach. They're thinking through what type of clients do I have, what type of prospects do I have, and what type of salespeople do I therefore need to have. And splitting up into things like major accounts. So this would be groups of people who all focused on maybe one large account, like I did at Hewlett-Packard for BT. Or at the other end of this spectrum, maybe for more transactional relationships, here's where you might use inbound, outbound telemarketing. So these might be people that don't even leave the premises, but are able to handle volume in a very, very cost-effective way. One of the big pieces of change that we are seeing, and I think you've read some of this in some of the previous chapters, is this notion of team selling. Selling as a team is becoming increasingly important. And part of the driver for that is because buyers are buying more in teams. What I mean by buying in teams is that within one company, you'll have multiple people all involved in making the decision. This has not always been the case. In fact, it's not that long ago that people would individually make very large purchasing decisions. But certainly since the downturn of '08 and as the economies started improving again, then what we found is that there is more team buying. A large part of this is to do with mitigating risk. A large part of this is to do with the fact that complex solutions very often have fingers into a large part of the enterprise. So if buyers are buying in teams, sellers need to sell in teams. And again, I spoke about this earlier on, as the product and service gets more complicated, it's almost impossible for one person in the selling organization to know everything that they need to know about the offering. So we're seeing team buying, we're seeing team selling, and this again is changing the type of person that companies need. The lone ranger, the salesperson that's just able and willing to and wants to operate on their own is no longer the most effective person when it comes to selling. Somebody who's able to work with other people is going to be critical and increasingly important for companies as they move forward. We talked a little bit about this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I think you are aware that increasingly digital is really becoming a substitute for personal selling. It is remarkable how much business now is transacted and how much business people buy without talking to any form of human being seller at all. And this is especially true when there's low customization required, when the product is simple, when it's transactional, when there's a low need for relationship between the buyer and the seller. And in fact, then total self-service, the ability to buy at any time, day or night, press a button and have it on your doorstep, sometimes the same day, is really important for buyers that don't value or don't need the relationship. Now, the flip end is the more complicated the product is, the more there is a need for this trust relationship, then the lower we can rely on the digital self-service and the more emphasis needs to be placed on personal selling. And so this again relates to the bifurcation I was talking about earlier on. I'll give you an example of how this has changed. I mean, you can go to a website, Lowe's.com. You're all aware, I'm sure, of Lowe's, the home improvement company. Lowe's.com now on the website has something called a deck designer. You can interact with the computer. It will ask you questions. So if you think about putting a deck on the side of your home, it will ask you questions about what size is the floor space that you want. How high off the ground is it? Because then it will calculate how many steps it needs. Do you want a hole for a spa? Well, heck yes. What? A nice big oval one. I mean, it asks you these questions. It asks you what type of railings you want. And then you press a button. It does all the structural calculations and calculates the bill of materials for your deck. I mean, that's a level of self-service digital where only a short time ago there would have to be expert salespeople involved in that interaction. This is the way the world is going. This is the world that we currently all live in. This is the world I'm sure you are relying on. And it really has thrown up in the air this whole notion of salespeople. And so what we need now increasingly, and this is what I think is what companies are short of, are salespeople who can build relationships and can have this consultative, value-added conversation. Now, finding people like this is really hard to do. One of the most difficult things that I ever had to do when I became a sales manager at HP was recruiting and finding really good salespeople. And it's a long, long process because you cannot get it wrong. You cannot afford to make a mistake. You recruit a bad salesperson, Sure, you lose money in the short term because they're not creating revenue for the business. But the worst thing is you recruit a bad salesperson, it typically costs you 15 months. As a manager, it typically costs you 15 months of your life because you don't expect them to perform initially. So you give them 3 or 4 months to settle in. And then maybe the next 3 or 4 months is when you discover that they're not really able to do the job. And so then they have to go on disciplinary, which again takes maybe 3 or 4 months. And then you have to get them out of the company, and then you have to start recruiting all over again. So I don't know if any of you are going to be going through a process for an interview process or a hiring process with and it's not just salespeople, but with a customer-oriented job. You are going to find that you're going to have to go through many, many hurdles. And the reason being that companies cannot get it wrong. It's a very expensive proposition to make a bad hiring mistake. When we were at Hewlett-Packard, it was easier. I mean, I was learning to interview and hire salespeople at HP in the mid-80s, and life was so much easier then because there were typically more good people on the marketplace. I don't think we were as focused on what it is that we were looking for. There wasn't as much science around interviewing. In fact, I remember my very first time learning to interview a salesperson. The way HP did it was that we practiced on real people. I sat in a room with a colleague of mine who was a more experienced sales manager, and he and I agreed how we were going to do this. I was going to watch him do the first interview, I was going to make some notes, and if I felt good about it, I was going to do the second interview. And this is exactly how many companies did it. So our day, I remember this first day forever. The first person comes in, and my colleague Pete asked him some questions. Some good questions. He asked him, what are your strengths? Typical. What are your weaknesses? And this person had some good answers. And then Pete, and I'll never forget this, he took a pen out of his pocket and he passed it over to the other person, and he said, you think you're a good salesperson? Sell me that. And so this person then went into what we called feature and advantage selling. He talked about the pen. He talked about it was retractable so it wouldn't make a mess in your pocket. He talked about the fact that you could refill it so it had longevity. It was long-term value. He talked about the fact that it had a medium nib and that you could use that for the majority of uses. It was the most ubiquitous in terms of usage. And so he came out with some good answers. He left, Pete and I talked about him, and then Pete said, how did I feel about taking the next person? I felt very comfortable. And so in comes, and I will remember this man for the rest of my life, in comes Brent Makinson, and he sits down, and Pete said, Dave has some questions for you. And I said, yes, I do. And so I started reading through Pete's list, and I had the strengths. What are your 3 strengths? And I had, what are your 3 weaknesses? And Brent was coming up with some good stuff. And then I had the pen. I thought I'll use Pete's pen trick. And I was writing with mine, so I asked Peter if I could borrow his very nice cross pen. So Pete passed me his pen, and I passed it across to the interviewee, and I said, all right, you think you're a good salesperson, sell me that. And without a second's hesitation, Brent took the pen out of my hands, put it into both of his, and broke it in 2, and said, you need a new one. Now, that's the first and only time I've ever had somebody in an interview break a pen as a way of demonstrating that they could sell. So the question I'm going to ask you, and I'd just like you to consider this for a second, is, should we hire Brent? Would you hire Brent? What would you do if somebody in an interview actually broke the pen? So just have a think about that for a moment. Okay, I'll tell you, here's what we did. We did hire Brent. And the reason we did it is because we saw in him some of the attitudes and attributes that we thought were going to be important to be a good salesperson. If you think about them, what were the attitudes that Brent demonstrated in that moment? Think about things like he was creative. He was a risk taker. He understood this connection between need and solution, and he demonstrated that in the moment. And the list goes on. So we hired Brent. Let me ask you a couple of supplemental questions just to think about. Question number 1 is this. How good a salesperson do you think Brent was? And the second question is, how easy or difficult do you think Brent was to manage? And the 2 sort of go together with that individual. In terms of his sales ability, he was a really good salesperson, especially hunting. He was very good at hunting, got very, very bored with farming. in terms of managing, he was very difficult to manage, because all those things about being a risk taker, about being creative, all those things that we wanted him to apply outside when he was selling, we really didn't want him to apply inside, because we really wanted him, like everybody else, to follow the rules. And this is a problem sometimes with salespeople. How you want them to perform internally might be very different to what it is that you're hiring for them to do when they leave the building. So just have a think about that, and especially think about it if you're interviewing for a sales-related job. Let me tell you a little bit about what it is I think today people are looking for when they're hiring salespeople. Or in fact, I would suggest that this applies for more than just salespeople, but certainly for customer-related people. The first thing they're going to check, and you see this in top right of the pie, is do you have the attributes? I mean, there's certain things, if somebody doesn't have these attributes, you will not hire them. And this might be a level of energy, this might be a level of empathy, this might be a level of relationship. And if you don't see those in somebody, then you go no further. So they're like table stakes. So I would suggest if you are in an interview in the near future, one of the things you have to do is make sure they see the real you, that they see the attributes that you carry, and that's they're obvious. The place you win or lose is the next place, which are these things called transferable skills and knowledge. And transferable skills and knowledge only come from two places, either from your formal education or from your previous experience. And it is this piece that people are really looking for as a differentiator, as a discriminator. Because the third part of the pie is always a gap, and there's always a gap. Nobody is perfect. But it's the size of the gap that matters, because a gap in and of itself means that somebody's going to take longer to become what we call performant, and it's going to cost more money. We're going to have to invest more in them. And so the smaller you can make the gap, then the better you look as a potential recruit. Now, the question then, of course, is, and I hope you're thinking about this from a practical perspective, how do you minimize the gap? It's really very easy. How you minimize the gap is demonstrate more transferable skill and knowledge. So what you have to do is when people ask you questions like, what did you do for the summer? You have to answer it in a way that minimizes the gap. And the way I suggest you do this is not just answer the question, where did you do your internship, or what did you do for the summer, but always think through the additional piece of, so what? So what I did for the summer was this, and what that meant I learned that's applicable to this job is this. So if you always make that connection, I think what you'll find is that you will be minimizing the gap in the perception of the interviewer, and that will position you much better for the role. Not talking about lying, cheating, stealing, not talking about any of that, but just make sure you make the connection, because the most difficult part of a sales manager's job, or any manager's job, I think, is recruiting good quality people. So just make sure that you minimize the gap by applying your previous education and experience. And you can see that when it comes to then doing this training, investing in people, it's true for everybody. Even the most expert salespeople will typically get more training. There'll be investment in them. There's a belief now that salespeople are trained, not born. That is very different to the early notions of the 60s and the 70s, when we really didn't understand the science of selling, and people used to think that salespeople were born, that it was a natural tendency that they had. We now know through all the research that we've done that that is patently not true. And in fact, many of the things that we used to think were good for salespeople actually do not apply anymore in the modern era. Customers are more educated and more knowledgeable than they have ever been before. And so the type of selling we all have to do is very, very different to what it used to be. And then training of salespeople is going to happen in multiple places. It's going to happen on the job to a large extent. Your manager will act very often as a coach. And as you can see at the bottom of this slide, it's never enough. It continues all the time. Selling is, I guess, a bit like medical surgery, that you can always learn, you're always being observed, mistakes are costly, and so really training never ends. But it happens in multiple places. It's a very exciting place to be trained, is when you're actually doing it on the job in front of a customer. And as you can see by this advert from an organization a short while ago, you you see the type of salespeople that they were looking for. And I think the graphic there is meant to represent that what they view. And I think this is the modern view, is that selling is so much more about listening than it is about talking. It's not so much about you. In fact, I would propose that the most successful salespeople are the ones that do not focus on themselves or their company or their product, but really focus on the customer. And that means you have to be a much better listener than you have to be a talker. So that's the development of people. In a moment, let's talk about how we compensate and motivate salespeople.